Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting of the Virtual Tasting Society. I am Vadim Perlovsky, and today we're excited to do the old lineup, a variety of brands, some of the oldest bourbon making brands in the nation, currently under the Beam portfolio. Joining us today is the awesome Edwin Cruz, back again to tell us all about these brands. So this is going to be one of those rare times where we're not just tasting one brand and multiple expressions from them, which we are tasting multiple expressions of each. But today we're going to try Old Granddad, Old Crow, Old Tub, Old. Everybody's got samples. Old Overholt. Overholt. There we go. So we got a fantastic lineup. We have 7 samples in front of us. So we're excited to taste through these. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know we have a lot of familiar faces, but a couple of newbies. So anyone who's here for the first time, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We like to keep it interactive, so feel free to ask questions, unmute yourself and participate, throw it in the chat, what have you. The only thing we ask is that when you're not talking, to keep yourself on mute so we don't talk over each other and have background noise and all that stuff. But other than that, we're here to get nerdy. We're here to have fun. Enjoy. Edwin?
Nice. Thanks, Vadim. Like you mentioned, these are part of our olds lineup. Everything that we're going to taste except for Old Tub. Order requests. Great. Yes, we're going to do it in this order. Old Crow, Old Overholt Bonded, Old Granddad Bonded, Old Granddad 114, and we're going to cap it off with Old Tub. If anyone needs me to repeat it again, well, I'll just kind of lean over. The only bottle I'm missing is the 114 right now. Just have a little sample of it over here. I mean, they're all over the place these days, but yeah, I made a mistake and left it somewhere else. Regardless, okay, so as I was saying, we're essentially stewards of these brands. We purchased them over the last, we'll get into how and why we purchased them. But we essentially see ourselves as guardians of these brands, and they fit nicely within the breadth of history of the James B. Beam Distilling Company. Of course, y'all have heard my spiel before, over 227 years now of history. And these brands have even more history than the James B. Beam Distilling Company. And as one of the oldest whiskey producing bourbon distilleries, it's cool for us to also honor the past and also honor some of our history. So full transparency, I think this is only the second time that I've ever chatted about these brands since I started. So yesterday was my 1-year anniversary in this position as American Whiskey Ambassador for the West Coast. So bear with me. I'll answer any answers that I don't have. I'll do my best to ask Fred or Freddie next time we're out at the distillery. I'll be out there again next month. So I'll have a little Q&A session with them. So feel free to throw notes or throw questions in the chat or speak up. And if I don't know the answer, as I said, I'll write it down and we'll try to work our way through it. There's a lot of, officially in the James B. Beam portfolio, we haven't kept a lot of history. So a lot of the history has been compiled by us, my predecessors as American Whiskey Ambassadors, other American Whiskey Ambassadors in Central and East Coast region. It's been a lot of collective knowledge from us who essentially love to geek out on whiskey and like really dig, and a couple of others within the company that really want to honor history. But the really cool thing is that we are now compiling all that information and essentially creating a database for these olds, and also trying to figure out ways how to like improve the liquid, but also how to honor the legacy of the people that came before us and the distillers that made all this happen originally. So we'll chat a little bit. There's a ton of history here. So if I'm going too fast, feel free to slow me down, but we'll try to get through all the history and try to get a little bit geeky about the before, the before and the afters of these, because there's a lot of rise and fall in this, as you'll see. And there's also going to be a lot of rise as well. But we'll get into that as we kind of move through the line. So I wanted to start with Old Crow because, well, yes, it is one of the lower proof whiskeys, but also when you hear the word Old Crow, I mean, the first time that I heard Old Crow, I was like, it's really like we make this like bottom shelf stuff without really understanding the huge historical importance of this brand and why we as a company purchased it. So really, like it's actually tolerable whiskey, but I wouldn't consider it like premium. So we're not really, none of these things are technically premium, but they're classics. And I'll get into a little bit of why I love some of these brands and also what I've learned about some of these brands, especially Old Crow. This is just something that I've personally have kind of fallen in love with as a brand. And a lot of other of my, not only American whiskey ambassadors, but other ambassadors from other brands, like really love Old Crow because of everything it brought to the American whiskey industry. So as I mentioned, like when I think about it, it's not usually something that I think about drinking, but it's really important for us to go through it and really understand the history behind it. So when we're really thinking about Old Crow, we're thinking about the science and the importance of its creator, Dr. James Crow. There was an actual Dr. James Crow, but it wasn't just Old Crow. Wasn't just a name that was come up with. It was somebody's last name. And Dr. James Crow really came to Kentucky back in the mid 1800s, 1838. Is when he came to Kentucky, and he was a Scotsman. He was somebody who had studied medicine and had studied science back in Scotland, and he moved to Kentucky after essentially going bankrupt in Scotland to start a new life. As a lot of people moved to Kentucky to start new lives for many different reasons. A lot of people, of course, including our founder Jacob Beam, our forefather, first generation distiller, who we considered first generation distiller. Jacob Beam moved to Kentucky on a land grant, and Dr. James Crow moved to Kentucky again on one of these land grants, essentially to start a new distillation business. He had this fascination with distillation back in Scotland, and he saw it as an opportunity to open a new business and start a new venture and start a new life away from medicine. So when I think about Dr. James Crow, I think about the scientific approach that he applied to the bourbon making process. He was one of the first people that really started taking notes. When I talk about whiskey, I like to talk about the art and the science and the balance between the art and the science of creating whiskey. So much is sensory based, so much is how we feel and like trying to adapt our senses to the humidity, to the heat, and really finding those nuances that come with that can be explained through science, but for generations and for hundreds of years have been left to the art of the master distiller. So he was one of those first people that started writing down, started tracking pH levels. He was tracking gravities, like alcohol gravities and temperatures. And most importantly, he was writing things down. He was setting things down on paper, not only for himself, but with the intention that these notes would be passed down through generations in order to continue improving the whiskey making process. And that's kind of a cool concept back in the mid 1800s, when most people were just distilling to make a living, not really distilling for the science of it, but really distilling to get rid of excess spent grain. In my last conversation with y'all regarding Basil Hayden, we were talking about how most farmers were distilling in order to essentially get rid of their excess spent grain to make a little extra money, to not hold a lot of physical grain in stock because it's volatile and it's messy and it takes up a lot of space. But he was distilling because he wanted to standardize the process of distillation. And while he didn't invent the sour mash process, he did become one of the people that essentially standardized that sour mash process in distilling spirits. He, again, embracing that art, like really understanding the science behind that sour mash process of introducing a little bit of the spent of the previous mash bill into the new mash bill, and what that did for the sake of whiskey. So he eventually in around the later part of the 1800s, he was hired by or essentially moved to the Old Pepper Distillery, which is currently the home of Woodford Reserve. And it was here that he essentially created or started distilling what would eventually become Old Crow. So because of the science, because of all this background that he had, and because of the standardized process, his whiskey was actually really, really good. While there was a lot of variation in a lot of like nuance in a lot of other whiskeys, he had perfected his specific preferred mash bill. Classic Kentucky high corn mash bill, but he had created consistency. Essentially, he had standardized that process and created essentially one of the first commercial operations. To the point that when he died in the not too long after, in 1856, the process didn't really stop. It just essentially continued on, and the Old Pepper Distillery continued producing Old Crow. It eventually became favorites to a lot of diplomats and politicians because of its quality. People like Ulysses S. Grant and Henry Clay. They were all Old Crow drinkers. It was, at that time, it was considered top notch, best of the best whiskey that you can find, because, again, I'll keep saying, because of the standardized process. So not only did he write his recipes down, but he also trained other distillers at Old Pepper to continue making Old Crow, keeping his ledgers and making copies of his ledgers to pass on to all of them long after his death. So a little bit after, a couple decades after, the brand was sold to a different distillery, the Gaines and Berry Company, and they decided to build a whole new distillery. And one of the other partners of this distillery was E.H. Taylor Jr. And E.H. Taylor had already been to Europe to have that same immersive experience, learn how to make whiskey, or learn the best methods of making whiskey in Scotland, Ireland, Germany, Spain, Italy. And he came home with all this knowledge to build upon the foundation that James C. Crowe essentially established, and continued making Old Crow whiskey, to the point that they were so proud of the Old Crow whiskey that they trademarked their company slogan became the makers of Old Crow. So there was a lot of really cool, like they were also one of the first brands to be heavily marketed throughout the late 1800s, distributing Old Crow in New, like really bringing attention to Old Crow, New York. So what they would do back in the late 1870s in order to build this goodwill towards politicians and influential people was that they would do what a lot of us do in PR or marketing, which is send bottles to people, send little gift packs and say, hey, this is coming to you from Old Crow, which at that point, again, people were not doing. And again, that's how Old Crow kept elevating their fame, and it kept becoming something super popular. They would make really cool little like Old Crow figurines. They were essentially crows that were dressed in tuxedos and top hats. So there's a lot of really cool old memorabilia from Old Crow that shows bottles of Old Crow in cool little packages with an adjacent little crow in a top hat and a tuxedo. So throughout the 19th century, Old Crow continued to kind of be the top whiskey. So one of the big things was that at this point, we're thinking about Old Crow being up here, and James B. Beam Distilling Company, Old Tub, Jim Beam, essentially making its way up. It wasn't, and they were our number one competitor. So towards the late, of course, Prohibition happened. I'm skipping ahead a little too much, but from the late 1800s to Prohibition, Old Crow was the number one whiskey, and part of that popularity was that they were one of the few whiskeys. A lot of the whiskeys back here were whiskeys that were still produced during Prohibition, eventually being purchased by national distillers, or at that time it was, oh my God, why am I blanking out on the name? Let's see if I can find it on my notes here. Where was I? We'll get back. Oh, yeah, national distillers. Sorry, I did say national distillers, right? Okay, don't answer that. So so we're looking now at post-prohibition. Old Crow continues to be the #1 selling whiskey, and it was purchased by national distillers. So throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, Old Crow and Jim Beam essentially came head to head, and there was a competition for what was the top whiskey, for what was the top American whiskey, bourbon, in the U.S. And Old Crow kept going steady until about the late 1940s, early 1950s, when eventually Jim Beam overtook it. And eventually it was there was a decline during the 60s in bourbon drinking, and national brands sold it to American brands, and American brands at this point was buying up a bunch of stuff. So they were holding Old Taylor, they were holding Old Grandad, and they were also holding Old Crow. And of course, like, they continued producing it, but at the same time changing the recipe. So this is when you first start seeing, around the late 1940s, early 50s, is when you first start seeing that big change in the quality and the fall. I mean, we were going to talk up and downs. You start seeing that fall in the recipe. They changed the flavor profile. In reality, nobody really knows why. It was never written, or nobody's ever found any evidence of exactly why it changed. Some people say it could be a cost-cutting measure, but there's this theory that the yeast strain was lost after Prohibition. And after Prohibition, since we don't really have a lot of bottles from 1930s, like all those bottles, anything that was produced post-Prohibition, there is a strong belief that it was not the same whiskey anymore. And national distillers continue to tweak after Prohibition, continue to try to find that right flavor profile. And sadly, it was just never found. Therefore, the quality kept decreasing. And eventually in '87, it was sold to James D. Beam Distilling Company. And we just kept producing. We stopped operations at the old distillery, and we started producing it at the Claremont campus. And we continued tweaking the flavor profile a little bit. So rather than using we essentially just bought the rights to the name Old Crow. And but the one big difference is that even though we changed the mash bill to be closer to what the Jim Beam mash bill would be, we didn't use and we still don't continue to use the same yeast strain that we use for Jim Beam. So this is where I like to talk about differences. So we've got this classic super heavy 65 to 67% corn mash bill in Jim Beam, which is very similar to the same mash bill, or essentially the same mash bill that you would find in Old Crow, but two very different yeast strains. Jim Beam, the Colonel James E. Beams essentially propagated a wild yeast strain for Jim Beam, and we continue to have that yeast strain. But we also have these old lineup which use commercially available yeast strains. Again, a lot of heritage and a lot of rise and falls. And at some point, we ended up also it started becoming a 3-year product. It had always been historically a 4-year product. So even when you look at it now, it still continues to be a 3-year product. But here's one really cool thing. In the last couple, and we'll talk more about this as we kind of head into Old Overholt, as the decades have kind of gone by, our intent has always been to improve and to learn the history of these brands in order to improve them. So Old Overholt was the very first one to start receiving an overhaul, and Old Overholt will continue receiving an overhaul, which we'll talk about later. But the next one up, I've started looking again. I always tell you guys like what's coming down the pipeline. I try as much as I can, whatever I can disclose. So you didn't hear, it's nothing official, but from what I've seen in our grand master plan of where we want to take all the things that we make, Old Crow is next in line to be restored back to a more classic, original historical mash bill and proof, because it holds so much history, because it was a favorite of most of the politicians in DC, of a lot of the generals. We want to make sure to honor that legacy and that history. So we're gonna work on making this better. But for now, I feel thankful that we're still holding on to one of the oldest American straight bourbon whiskey brands with all that history since, as it says on the bottle, since 1835. So if y'all have your little samples, let's pour it out, and let's pour some out, and let's give it a whirl.
One question on Old Overholt, on Old Crow.
Mhm.
I've heard you guys are famous for the chess pieces, if you can talk about those. The Old Crow ceramic chess pieces.
Yeah, so I don't know very much about the chess pieces. Let's see.
Vicky's holding up a photo of them. They're like humongous.
Wait 1 second. Wait, who's holding one up?
Vicky.
Oh, let's see if I can make this bigger.
There you
Oh.
go.
Cool. I do not know a lot about those.
Okay.
If anyone knows a little bit about them, like, I'd love to know more.
Yeah, I know people that are still trying to rebuild the collection, but my understanding is at the time it was released as a 10-year-old.
Oh, great.
And-
That's, I wish we had a set of those at the distillery. I'm gonna try to see what else I can find about them, because how cool would it be if we started making those again? You see, I always learn something new from you guys.
Yeah.
As well.
And it was bottled at 86 at the time.
Yes. Yeah, the again, the proof has changed, and now it's 80 proof instead of being that classic like 86 proof chess pieces. Right, I'll see what I can find about some more, if I can find anything else about these.
On the nose, it's dusty, but also grapey. It's interesting.
Hmm.
And I think the whole lineup today is a very fun dive into affordable whiskey. Like, I think OGD 114 is the most expensive at $30.
Right.
So,
yeah. Okay, I
it-
see Todd saying not straight if younger than 4 years. Oh, so straight is the distillate has to be a minimum of 2 years to be called straight. But if it's younger than 4 years, the age statement has to be on the bottle. So if you look at the back of the bottle of Old Crow, it'll say aged for a full 3 years in new charred white oak barrels. Very little back here. You can see that. So since we have to disclose the age statement, 3-year-old whiskey.
I know you had mentioned the yeast being different and being a year younger than the white label. Is there any other differences, like warehouse or location, that leads to, I mean, the significant difference for even just a 1 year change?
Considerably, yeah. At Beam, we so for some of these lesser, I'm not going to call them lesser brands, but not part of the core lineup brands, we are even though this is not fully displayed, it's a combination of classic rick houses and also palletized rick houses. So you're going to have a little bit of variation between the two, mainly because of those palletized warehouses. I think this is not official, but just knowing how we store things, anything that's in a palletized warehouse is not ever going to become anything James B. Beam. But it'll potentially be, some of it will definitely be a part of what Old Crow is right now. And of course, that's going to change the flavor profile completely. But also, like, you see the effect of like 1 year younger and using a commercially available yeast versus using a traditional yeast that we would use for everything else. It just doesn't have the nose is pleasant enough. The body is, some of the body's there, but it's lacking some of those some of that depth, I'd say. Like, I don't get the classic the 3 classics that I get from anything Beam, like the heavy vanilla caramel, the citrus, and the nuttiness. This is more, of course, like, you get a little bit more heat in the front, but I feel that it opens up a little bit more into like earthy, almost like not dusty tones, but definitely more earthy notes. Vadim, I think you were saying something and I interrupted you as we were kind of talking through it.
Must not be that important.
But
Oh,
so Oak Curl serves as a very interesting jumping off point for everything, right? And I don't know about you, but I don't know about everybody else, but um, I haven't pulled this bottle of vodka out in a good while, so it's super interesting to pull it out again and give it a whirl. Are there any other questions right now about Old Crow before we kind of move on? Nope.
this is very
Yeah.
drinkable. I mean,
Yeah. I agree. It's not rot gut for sure. There's definitely some character, some body to it. And somebody poured me a shot, I wouldn't turn it down, or I wouldn't like turn my nose up to it. Okay, well, with that, let's move on to Old Overholt. And Old Overholt, he is one of my favorite brands. I mean, Old Overholt holds a very special place in my heart. It was the very first rye that I ever had as a baby bartender a long time ago. When there was really no rye out available on market. This is even before I even learned what Rittenhouse was, which both of them were in tandem, but Old Overholt beat out Rittenhouse in terms of becoming the very first rye that I ever had. And it always has that very nostalgic quality for me. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And the reason that it has that nostalgia for a lot of people is because, again, it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously maintained brands of rye in the US or of any American whiskey in the US. So there's a lot of history in Old Overholt. This is the first brand, like as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the very first brands that we started compiling tons of history and tons of information on. So I'm going to try to move through some of this history at a good clip. But if anything stands out or you have any questions, I kind of move through it, again, stop me. So Old Overholt really kicks off, and I'll kind of stop halfway and we'll drink through one, and then we'll drink through the first we'll drink through the old classic Overholt, and then we'll drink through the bonded about halfway through. So Old Overholt really starts off in 1800, in the actual year 1800, in West Overton, Pennsylvania, with Henry Overholter, whose last name was later anglicized to Overholt, and his wife. They were essentially Mennonites that traveled to Pennsylvania and settled, and they came with the knowledge of rye distillation because, of course, as we know, rye was really difficult to grow in the southern states, but rye grew abundantly in Pennsylvania. And historically, rye has always been the predominant grain for distilling any sort of grain whiskeys in the United States. And of course, Pennsylvania is one of the homes, if not the home, of rye whiskey. So he essentially bought 260 acres along what is now Scottsdale, Pennsylvania, and Mount Pleasant, very close to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this is where he founded West Overton Village. And so him and his family essentially started there, and he settled. In 1810, his son Abraham Overholt, who is the man on the bottle, took over essentially West Overton operations at the age of 26 years old. And he started maintaining their rye whiskey brands. He had grown up as a farmer and grown up mainly as a distiller, but he had this like true passion and true love for distilling rye. It wasn't more than just a job for him. He wanted the distillery to be, he wanted everything at the distillery to be self-sufficient, and in a very progressive entrepreneurial spirit, he also wrote down plans for creating zero waste, which of course nobody was thinking about zero waste. But of course, if you think about zero waste, it can be very cost effective. So he was looking for more ways to make money. And the way that he was going to make money was by creating a fully sustainable, fully running zero waste distillery back in 1810 when he took over at 26 years old, which is really cool. So around the 1820s, he continues business operations and is producing about 12 to 15 gallons of whiskey a day, shipping them down towards Ohio to Mississippi and to New Orleans. So again, New Orleans seemed to be like the hub for everything being shipped. And of course, that pales in comparison to the scale of things that we're producing nowadays. But 12 to 15 gallons a day is a pretty solid distilling operation. So he continues doing this until he collects a little bit more capital and expands the distillery in the 1830s tenfold. He buys all the property around it in order to really create this vision of a full, sustainable, all encompassing distillery, including a grist mill, more farmland, more warehouses in order for him to lay down more whiskey. And branding, we start seeing branding for Old Overholt as early as 1843. So again, not just Old Crow, but Old Overholt. Like, so Old Crow might have been doing bourbon, but then you've got this family in Pennsylvania distilling rye in direct competition. So two top tier companies in the mid 1840s. This is a time again when the concept of publications and of publishing advertisements didn't really exist, but he felt that the reputation that he had created for himself was worth showcasing and advertising for. So in 1849, Henry Clay, very important name, is born at West Overton, and he was a son of John Frick and Elizabeth Overholt. So Abraham Overholt hires John W. Frick, who would eventually become the father to Henry Clay Frick at West Overton, and they all go into business together. Henry Clay and Jacob Overholt and Henry Overholt essentially all come together to build a new distillery on the site. And now we're reaching the 1850s when they are producing. So we went from 12 to 15 gallons per day just a couple of decades earlier in the 1820s to the late 1850s when they're producing about 860 gallons of what they used to call old farm pure rye back in the day. So when we're thinking, and they were producing in a style that we called Monongahela. So Monongahela, as opposed to your classic rye formula, maybe I should cover that a little bit. When we're thinking about classic rye, we're thinking about a blend of at least 51% rye, corn, and malted barley. Traditionally, anything that comes from Kentucky, I like to call Kentucky rye. It's about 51%, 51 to 60%. That's just from the average that I've come up with, but it's not that much rye. There's plenty, there's enough to be legal, but everything else is corn and malted barley. When you're thinking about a Monongahela rye, you're thinking mainly rye and malted barley. So just two ingredients as opposed to three, a combination of three different mash bills or three different grains, I'm sorry. But the big thing is that at this point, Abraham is 75 years old and he's producing a ton of whiskey. The expansion really worked and his sustainability efforts really worked and his production and distillation skyrocketed. So a year later, Abraham dies, and Jacob Overholt dies, and Abraham essentially buys 2/3 shares of the distillery of Old Monongahela Distillery and names it the A.H.N.S. Overholt Company. He had visions for producing much more than that. Of course, 1861, Civil War starts, and it became Old Overholt essentially became the preferred supplier for the Union, and it was a very, very lucrative time for Old Overholt. They became one of the most influential whiskey producing families in the United States. Fast forward to 1870, Abraham Overholt dies at 86. And the company kind of goes into a little bit of turmoil. Of course, Abraham was the anchor of that distillery at that point. But then in the late 1880s, Henry Clay Frick, who had spent most of his time living in West Overton, takes over. Yeah, 86 is pretty old when we're thinking about age back in the 1880s, right? And Henry Clay Frick essentially was a very shrewd businessman. I know that name sounds familiar because Henry Clay was a magnate in the coal and coke business, and he had established a ton of business producing coal, and he decides to go into business with one of his steel partners, who was Andrew Carnegie. So at this point, Andrew Carnegie and owns 1/3 of the company, and Henry Clay Frick owns 2/3 of the company. And by his 32nd birthday, Henry Clay is essentially a millionaire, which I don't know what that translates into. Like, I should have maybe translated what $1 million back in 1881 is nowadays, but it's a lot of money. And he turns his attention into growing the company even more. So he seeks out more investors. He recruits Andrew Mellon and sells off 1/3 of the stake. So now it's Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, and Andrew Carnegie owning the West Overton and AHS Overholt company. Pretty cool. Yep. Let's see. Oh my God. $32 million. Not bad. Not bad. So then, of course, we start heading towards prohibition. Of course, like the company expands and it grows and it diversifies, and you've got a lot of cool things. He essentially like turns into glass. He builds a glass bottling facility on the campus, and at this point, now they're producing. Now we went from 860 gallons in the kind of mid 1800s to the late 1880s. They're producing 3,500 gallons of rye per day. So huge expansion. And of course, it only helped when in 1897, the US Bottle and Bond Act was implemented. And Old Overholt is the very first company to take advantage of the US Bottle and Bond Act. So I'll just explain what bottle and bond is for anyone who's not super familiar. I'm sure all of you know what bottle and bond is, but just as a recap, bottle and bond is whiskey that's produced in one distillation season, whether that's January through June or July through December, at one US distillery, which in this case was the Overholt distillery. It must be aged in US supervised warehouses for at least 4 years. That was government regulated and government sealed in those days, bottled at 50% or aka 100 ABV, 100 proof. And then it must be labeled with the name of the distillery at which it was distilled at, and if it's different, where it was bottled. So all of these were essentially a sign from the federal government saying, hey, we want to create high quality whiskey. This is how we're going to do it, and we're going to regulate it. And of course, having super deep ties in politics, the Overholts take full advantage of it. Yes, lots of history. And this is all important because it all ties in back into everything else that we're going to talk about. So we'll skip through prohibition. Again, Old Overholt, because of the connections to the Mellons, is one of the few ryes to be distilled throughout prohibition. And during partnership, Andrew Mellon is sworn in as Secretary of Treasury for President Harding. And because he was Secretary of the Treasury, he secured a medical license to continue producing at full capacity. Old Overholt continued to produce at full capacity throughout prohibition because he just happened to be a board member. How convenient, right? So this is when we start, after prohibition, essentially we start seeing the decline, and we start seeing bourbon essentially start taking over. We're gonna skip a lot because that was really the big shift. That was Old Overholt at peak. So by this time, by the early 1900s, now we're up to 375,000 gallons of whiskey that in Pennsylvania of whiskey that was being produced throughout the US. And rye went from about 80% market share to about 38% market share because the federal government allowed for greater expansion in distillation throughout other regions. So we're gonna jump to, we continue the decline throughout World War II because, of course, as we started seeing during World War II, Old Crow became the preferred whiskey to drink in the United States. And they were producing a ton more whiskey now than the Overholt distillery. And by the 1940s, people were not drinking rye anymore. There was that steady decline and that steady close of business, and um, the loss of prestige that came along with it. And of course, during the late 40s and 50s, vodka took that big rise and took all the market share away from Old Overholt. So it was around late 1940s, early 1950s that the Overholt distilleries were essentially sold again to national distillers, and national distillers took over operation, but they stopped producing all this history starts getting really murky because there's not a lot of records, because national distillers never really took a lot of clearly didn't take a lot of copious notes on what the heck was going on. All we know is that they stopped producing Old Overholt at West Overton. They started producing Old Overholt in Kentucky, and they started changing and tweaking the formula again. So the formula in the 40s and 50s started changing, and we're not exactly sure, again, what the reason was for that. And to the point where by the 80s, the brand is essentially unrecognizable. It gets sold to American spirits, American brands, I'm sorry, which again, owned by this point, owned Old Taylor and Old Crow. And eventually it all gets sold to James B. Beam Distilling Company, which takes us to the 1990s, when the liquid was finally dropped to 80 proof. So we lost that historic 86 proof. So it was during National Distillers that the 114 was introduced. So at the very beginning, when National Distillers first purchased Old Overholt, they were trying to keep that historic mash bill. They were trying to like create new things. I mean, they were responsible for introducing 114, but the quality just wasn't there. And Old Overholt stopped becoming what we considered Pennsylvania rye, and it would just become a legend. It was just something that people remembered, which is where we come in. So for a couple of decades, we essentially neglected the brand. We continued distilling it, and we continued producing essentially a very watered down interpretation of it, just using 51% rye. And not really putting a lot of effort or energy into it. We had other priorities and other things to grow. But back in 2017 is when we start seeing the first resurgence. That's when I started with Beam, when I started seeing the first rise in rye. And the very first thing we did was introduce, before I get into that, was the bottle and bond. And the bottle and bond kind of restored. It didn't change the mash bill. It was still kind of a lower style rye. It's still about 57% rye, and the rest of it's corn and malted barley. But it brought back that historic bonded style that had been discontinued from Old Overholt so long ago. And the first time we're going to taste Old Overholt straight rye. And you know how we were talking about losing that 80 proof? So just this past year, we reintroduced the 86 proof to Old Overholt as a permanent expression. So that's why originally, I think in the lineup, I had 80 proof. I thought I still had 80 proof bottles hanging around, and I realized that I drank all the 80 proof bottles. It's my everyday whiskey. So I kind of pulled this bottle off whenever I want a cocktail, and sadly I drank them all. I'm sure there's a ton of them floating around somewhere in some dusty liquor store, which I'm going to go hunt. But all the bottles that I had in my possession and in my storage were 86 proof. But it's for the best. It's honestly, it tastes a hell of a lot better than it did, and it was already super easy and sessionable for me to drink. So let's pour some. Let's drink. I think I've talked enough, and I'm getting thirsty. So very much in the same fashion as Old Crow, we're using a more commercially available yeast. But one of the really interesting things about Old Overholt is because now we have all the history and all this information from West Overton, and we're working very closely with the Historical Society of West Overton, Pennsylvania. We're learning a ton of information, and we're still getting information on a daily basis, to the point where we have a small group within the company that their full responsibility is looking through history and looking through all the old records and pulling as much historical, scientific, and scientific data that we have on Old Overholt in order to in order to improve the quality of the liquid that's in here. And so that change is going to be something that's good. That's, again, something that they were working on for the future, for the next 2 or 3 years, is that we're going to introduce a more classic Monongahela style rye. One of those classic historic mash bills that are just rye and malted barley. It will be under the Overholt name, but just like Abraham Overholt diversified, we're going to diversify a little bit, and it'll be a Overholt Monongahela rye versus our classic. And this will continue to be classic until we fine tune enough, until we feel comfortable. So we'll have an extension to the lineup for the very first time. And wow, since the, let's see, I have a date here somewhere. Since when was 114 introduced? Here we go. Yeah, mid 1930s, 1938, 1939. So really excited about what's coming for Old Overholt, and I'm really excited to share more history and more information. We could have spent a whole hour and a half, 2 hours talking about all the history and looking at charts, looking at pictures, looking at history on just one specific distillery and all the people that were involved and all the aspects of history that Old Overholt played a role in. But for now, we can enjoy together. Yes, it does have to. Does have to be some. I believe there does have to be some river water. I can't talk any much more about that project. It's going to be a small production, and it won't be something that's necessarily coming out of the James Beebe Distillery, but it's something that we're working on as a company. More stuff will be coming down the pipeline. Even I don't have all the details on what we're working on. That team has been very secretive about what they're working on. I just know that there's something really cool coming down the pipeline. Again, you get a little bit of hit of that 86 proof, that alcohol, but it opens up for me very grainy, much more character than the Old Crow. Of course, we're talking rye versus bourbon, so a lot more spice on the nose. But once it opens up and once you let a little bit of that alcohol evaporate, I think it opens up quite pleasant. The finish is a little short for me, but I think the front and the mid palate really open up well and really showcase that grain, that rye influence. A lot of spice on the front, but then it opens up pretty pleasantly. You get a little bit of that sweetness from that higher corn content, but again, at 86 proof, even the 86 proof is great as a Boilermaker. I used to be, when we couldn't get the bonded, we would just sip 86 and beer. And so, like, whenever I think of Old Overholt, classic Old Overholt, before getting into the bonded, I always think of having a cold, like we call it, a cold one and an old one. So, like, give me a cold one. For me, it was always Coors Banquet or Miller High Life, because why not when you're drinking like a classic American rye, and a little like 86 proof, or that at that time 80 proof Old Overholt. Indeed fancy. You know, I like to class it up every once in a while. We'll drink something extra nice. Champagne of beers. All right, we will move on to the bonded now. So the bonded is my favorite expression of Old Overholt. I think it really captures the essence of what Overholt is and can be. It's my preferred go-to rye whenever I'm making cocktails for friends and I'm introducing them to rye. A lot of my friends enjoy bourbon, but rye just tends to be a little spicy for them, or they want to find something that's kind of a daily drinker. And I always recommend that they pick up a bottle of Overholt bonded. That 4-year 100 proof really retains a lot of character, a lot of flavor, a lot of body at the end, and it's amazing in cocktails. Manhattans or whiskey sours. I like classics, but every once in a while I'll mess with a whiskey like Collins or Sling, and I've never gone wrong with Old Overholt. It has a different flavor profile than something like Rittenhouse. I feel like Rittenhouse is really good for certain applications. I think it has a lot of like really good body to it. But for some of those like more delicate Amaros and vermouths, it can be a little it can overtake the flavor profile. I find that Overholt plays extremely well with just about everything you throw at it. Um, and I've never had anyone be disappointed in a cocktail that I've made with it. So it's honestly for the resurgence, for the rebirth. So we talked about the rise, the fall, and now the rebirth of rye. I think this was one of the coolest things to happen to in the rye drinking world. So the 114 is currently, it was only supposed to be something that was available in select states and mainly Pennsylvania. We ran into some issues, and most of it was purchased by one person, which was really unfortunate. There's a whole article on it. Just look it up. But there are talks of making it, of extending the lineup and offering it in other markets. I've seen it floating around in Kentucky. I haven't seen anything about it coming to the West Coast, but if I hear of anything, I'll make sure to let y'all know. Yeah. I, for one, I'm keeping my fingers crossed because the 114 is really good. I just didn't want to tease you with something that you can't get anywhere. I mean, unless you buy it off one particular reseller. I'm sure there are a couple more floating around, but somebody took the bulk of them. Yeah, so the bonded just essentially takes that same mouthfeel and kind of goes and runs a little wilder with it. I get a lot more of the rice spice, and the finish is where it really shines. I think the finish opens up a lot bigger. It doesn't, like, if I'm thinking about how I'm a visual person, so I think about Old Overholt opening, like starting strong and then becoming like tapering off at the very, very end, closing, and finishing very, very soft. But Old Overholt, the bonded, I feel like opens up a little bit narrower, and then opens up a little bit more as you for the finish and for that mid palate. What y'all think? Vadim, do you have a fave on either one of these?
I enjoyed the 86 a lot.
Yeah.
It's definitely, I could see why it's your daily.
Easy drinking. All right. Well, thank you for letting me listen. Just spew information and dates about Old Overholt. There is a lot to talk about Old Overholt. For the next couple, there is substantially less information and history available. Again, it's a work in progress, and it's like the information that we're slowly compiling will just continue to grow as we pay more attention to these brands that are truly historic. So the next whiskeys that we're going to taste are going to be part of the Old Grandad lineup. Grandad. Oh, one fun fact here, and one of the reasons that I wish I had the Old Overholt bottle, the older Old Overholt bottle. Oh, this one still has it. Excellent. This is one of my older bottles that I pulled from the first set of bonnets. So if you look at the bottle, you'll see Abraham Overholt. He was a very grumpy man, but his grandson and great grandson decided that as a marketing move, they didn't like his frown, that he would turn off customers, and it would give off the impression of it not being a high quality rye. So they removed the smile, they removed the frown, and they made him smile. And it was like that for decades, until very recently when
it's like Mona Lisa.
exactly. when we restored the frown, we turned that smile upside down and gave him back his frown, as it should be, as it originally was on the original labels, which is pretty funny. Just seeing the frown back. Like he was he was a grumpy old man. Very shrewd businessman, but he was grumpy, and that was his reputation. So why not honor that reputation? And normally we go the other way, but why not give him his crown back? And again, Old Overholt is one final note is that Old Overholt is non-chill filtered, so you will get that as much of a full flavor of rye as possible, even though it doesn't have that historic Pennsylvania rye mash bill. It'll still have a lot more character than something that's been chill filtered that has stripped a little bit more of those oils. So just something fun to note on Old Overholt. Though I had ran into one issue, so I was side tangent story. I was recently in Alaska, and I walked into a bar, and I was being introduced, and the first thing somebody told me was like, "Hey, I got some bottles of Old Overholt bonded, and they were cloudy, and they had sediment at the bottom." And I was like, "Oh, the bottles flopped, the bottles froze over, and all the oils essentially coagulated and settled to the bottom." But I explained to them, "Hey, this is just part of the natural process of non-chill filtration. You're going to retain a lot more of the oils in your rye, so the whiskey's not spoiled. I'm sorry that the whiskey froze being shipped up to Alaska, but trust me, it's still really good for you to drink, and don't be afraid of a little separation." But yeah, if you put it in the freezer or you put it under really cold conditions, Old Overholt you'll see at some point little sediment or a little separation. Just something fun to note. Okay, so Old Grandad, another one of the olds. So again, Old Grandad for me was always one of these like super cool bartender secrets. You would go into a bar, and the first thing that somebody would do would be to put a little glass down and give you the bartender's handshake. And the bartender's handshake was always Old Grandad, which is a high rye mash bill. Old Grandad is, again, a very affordable whiskey. And I know we've talked about Old Grandad because I talked to all of you about Meredith Basil Hayden last time. I think most of you were on that call when we were talking about Meredith Basil Hayden and how Meredith Basil Hayden, who is the Old Grandad, the man on the bottle, was responsible for Jacob Beam becoming a full-time distiller in Kentucky. And without Old Grandad, without Meredith Basil Hayden, we wouldn't have anything in the James B. Beam lineup because he, I credit him, and all of us credit him with that introduction. So this is a brand that's been around since 1882, a lot longer than. So Old Grandad was essentially introduced by his grandson, Raymond Bishop Hayden, and Raymond Bishop Hayden came from his distilling family. So Meredith Basil Hayden was continued distilling and continued distilling throughout his life, and so did his grandchildren. But he was the one who wanted to honor the historic mash bill that his grandfather had taught him how to distill, which was, again, if y'all remember, Meredith Basil Hayden was called the king of high rye when he was distilling rye whiskey in Pennsylvania. Upon moving down to Kentucky, he essentially switched operations and started distilling a high rye bourbon. So if we're thinking about mash bills, and we were talking about using at least 51% rye for rye, Old Grandad uses just about double the amount of rye that you would find in a classic or Jim Beam mash bill. So we're using about 25 to 27% rye content in Old Grandad, and the rest of it's going to be corn and malted barley. And again, this is one of those old historic brands that continued distilling throughout Prohibition. And again, it was distilled to be an homage to this family of distillers. And like it was a very famous, popular brand. and it eventually was sold to a competitor, the Ferrelli Distilling Company, and they continued to produce Old Grandad very much in the same traditional way that it had always been distilled. And the brand really started running into issues during the late 1800s with the Bottle and Bond Act. They were a little bit late to the game for a bourbon company to produce bonded bourbon. So they started suffering because they didn't expand and they didn't adopt the bottle and bond style of distillation. They lost a lot of market share to competitors. So by 1899, they had been sold again to a different family, the Wathen family at this point. And there were still ties to the Haydens. There were some family connections there, but the distillery and the transition from the Old Grandad distillery was difficult. And that was also met by a lot of tragedy. There was a big fire at the distillery, and the full operation essentially burned down a couple of years, I believe less than a decade after the Wathen family took over the whole production. So once the distillery was rebuilt, they started producing again, but even though they did a great job of restoring the distillery, it just wasn't the same. And it really never recovered back from its heydays in the 1800s. Of course, they were able to obtain a medicinal license, so they continued producing whiskey throughout Prohibition. And Old Grandad, like I said, continued to be produced throughout Prohibition. And eventually the brand was sold to the American Medicinal Spirits Company, which was eventually bought by National Distillers. Again, National Distillers keeps coming back. But this happened a little bit earlier, 1929. So this was a very first brand. Yes, medicinal license was worth its weight in gold. In National Distillers, and since National Distillers ended up buying the American Medicinal Spirits Company, they ended up inheriting all these things. So 1929, Old Grandad was, I think, the very first brand that they purchased. And again, they kind of took ownership and stewardship of it, and they started producing they started producing the bonded again, and they also started introducing the world to the 114 line, which we happen to have all three today, so we get to taste the full progression. So for years, it was just Old Grandad and Old Grandad bonded. The bonded stopped being produced, or first of all, started being produced late in the game. Then it stopped being produced after the big giant fire and the distillery essentially burned down. And then once it was bought by National Distillers, they started reintroducing the bonded and also the 114. And then again, in 87, it was the brand was sold to James B. Bean Distilling Company, and it became part of the old lineup. And we still produce it. This is when I was talking about the difference when I was talking about Basil Hayden earlier on, I always refer to it as a high rye bourbon, right? High rye mash bill. And it shares the same mash bill as Old Grandad in honor of Meredith Basil Hayden. But again, the big difference is that, none of this is palletized. All of this is stored in traditional ricks, but we're dealing with two different yeast strains. So if y'all happen to have a bottle of Basil Hayden somewhere, after the call, I think it'd be cool to pull that out and save a tiny little bit of this and see the effect that that yeast has on the whiskey itself. So let's drink some Old Grandad in honor of Meredith Basil Hayden.
We keep talking about the 114. Where does that come from? Because I'm seeing that pop up a lot. Is that my understanding is that barrel entry proof?
Yeah, so barrel entry proof was around 114 is kind of like a historic proof. So a lot of whiskeys were introduced at around 107 proof into the barrels. So they would always the perfect time for them to come out would be around 114 proof. So 114 proof essentially started becoming standard for anything higher end because it just produced a lot more body and character. If they allowed it to age anymore and for the proof to be any lower or higher, it would throw off a flavor profile. So 114 essentially became the standard for pulling whiskey out of barrels at cask strength. And so everybody was hunting for those cask strength 114 proof. Even though the 114 Old Overholt and Old Grandad aren't cask strength, they're diluted down to 114. We're still trying to honor that legacy, and who knows, maybe down the line at some point we'll revitalize Old Grandad. And my hope is that they're eventually allowed to play with that historic 114 proof at cask, which would be really cool. So hopefully we live long enough to see that happen. Oh, I just poured myself more regular Grandad. I just poured myself Old Grandad on Old Overholt. Again, very different nose. You still get a little bit of those characteristics, so that very light, like almost like dried fruit mixed with baking spice, some sort of like, not cinnamon, but like for me, I get a lot of like cardamom-y fennel thing going on with it, which is the same thing that I get for Basil Hayden, but the nose doesn't open up as much. It's a little bit less. It's a little less tight than I would find in Basil Hayden. It opens up a little bit more. And again, the finish is very clean, very easy drinking. This is, I like to call this, I almost call it summertime bourbon. I know that I called Basil Hayden sessionable whiskey the other day, but I couldn't think of another term because they don't like us using the term sessionable. But I'm gonna start calling it summertime whiskey because it, at 80 proof or even at even bonded, I'm still gonna drink this like over sweet tea or just something like over something crushed ice, a julep. Just a very classic nose and a very classic American whiskey flavor profile. Bullseye. Nothing unpleasant about this. I find that that Old Grandad, along with Old Overholt, just have very iconic flavor profiles that everyone's familiar with. Nobody's ever told me I truly hate Old Grandad. It doesn't have that super medicinal bite that some whiskeys, that some of the Valley whiskeys have. I mean, for the price, for the money, what are bottles of Old Grandad going for nowadays? Old Grandad, $14, $15. The value, the price for the quality that you're getting is high. So I'm really happy that we're still producing and we're trying to honor this brand. But at some point, we'll do it justice and make it even better. But just like everything else, we are trying to take steps to make things a little bit better. And that includes Grandad, Old Grandad bonded, sitting at 100 proof, of course. New fresh bottle for me. So again, when we're thinking about flavor profiles, it might be just a little rough around the edges. You get a little bit of burn on the nose, but it is 100 proof whiskey after all, right? But it's full of flavor. It's one of these whiskeys that I always find has a very like round caramel and vanilla characteristic. So, for anyone who, don't quote me on this again, but I like to be candid with all of you. For anyone looking for a Basil Hayden style mash bill that's a little bit higher proof, you can't go wrong with Old Grandad bonded. It hits all those same classic characteristics that people love about our other brand. The price is also better, but if what you're looking for is something a little higher proof to mix and to make cocktails with, bourbon cocktails specifically, it's amazing. Yeah, all that like juicy caramel right at the front, and then as you kind of go towards the end, the back notes. You get all these like softer, more delicate notes, a little bit of alcohol on the back note. And then for me, it just finishes with a little bit of acidity, which I'm always looking for just a little bit of acidity. I want to salivate. And this is one of these bourbons that always makes me salivate. One of my favorite. As you can tell, I'm a fan of bonded whiskeys. But you can't go wrong with either the Overholt or Granite. I think we've done some justice to them, and we are continuously trying to improve the quality on our whiskeys. As I've mentioned before, James B. Beam Distilling Company is a company of progress. So while we value our history and our legacy, we're always trying to find ways to improve whatever we're making to make it better for all of you. And let me grab my 114 and we'll go through the 114. What did we think about the bonded? Yeah.
Yep. You should always start at 100 proof. Start there. Just start there.
What was that? One more time?
Just start at 100 proof. Good starting point, 100 proof. Yep.
Yeah, starting proof is 100 proof. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of oh, ginger snap. That's a good description. Yeah. A little doughy, a little, yeah. I like it. A little bit of spice on the back end. Yep. Okay, so let's drink some 114.
Okay, let's.
I mean, I'm trying to sip all three of them, and if I didn't know they were the same thing, I don't think I would know they were the same thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that bonding process really, and how the proofing like really changes the flavor profile. So for Old Grandad and for Old Overholt, we're not pulling in that classic like Jim Beam circle that I always talk about. The Jim Beam, the basil and knob, the Booker's in the middle, and the Baker's kind of more a cross section. We're applying a kind of a cross sectional pull for just about everything. So whether it's bonded, whether it's classic, whether it's 114, we're pulling from essentially like an X throughout everything we're pulling out from the rook houses. And to answer your question, Old Grandad and Old Overholt, most of the Old Grandad, they all kind of like live in the same space. So everything James B. Beam sits in certain warehouses, and everything that's not essentially sits in different warehouses. But Old Overholt and Old Grandad are not palletized. They're all just classic ricks, like the classic 3-tier, 7-story rick house. So the flavor is definitely going to be present there. But I like that you mentioned that they can taste completely different, because I agree with you. Like the 114, if I put the 114 and the bonded next to each other, it tastes like two completely different whiskeys. But again, you've got 63 to 65% corn, 25 to 20% rye, and then the rest of it's still going to be malted barley. So the only change in this one is 114 proof. Like this one was always one of my faves as well. I mean, around $25, $114 proof whiskey. This to me is one of those kind of hidden gems that are not so hidden anymore, of course, because it gets harder and harder to find 114 these days. And that's also another issue like that people always bring up is 114 discontinued. 114 is not discontinued. I know that in 2016, 2017, there was talks about possibly discontinuing it or taking it off the market temporarily to rework it, but no current plans to do that. It's just the bottle and distribution of it have been really, really difficult. I mean, a bottle that looks like a classic whiskey bottle is much easier to produce and find than the 114 bottle. So we've just been running into a lot of production issues with 114. Not the liquid's there, it's just essentially a bottling issue for us at this point. So I'm taking that caramel and I'm almost getting like creme brulee, a lot more burnt sugar and brown sugar, and you get a little bit more of that heat on the front palate from the rye. I think it's still pretty similar to the heat that you find in the bonded, but for me the two big things are the big increase in kind of that burnt sugar note that I get right off the bat on the nose. The rye is still there on the palate. I still get all the nice characteristics, all the astringency that I would classically get from Old Grandad. But the finish is just a little bit longer. It's got a little bit more of like a cinnamon back note to it. And it opens up really nicely. I think out of all of them, the 114 to me deserves to be enjoyed neat. You can easily be enjoyed in a cocktail. And I've made so many delicious cocktails, toddies with it. But if I just had a neat pour of this or pour over like a big cube, I'd be a happy man.
Yeah, 114 is my flask whiskey.
Nice.
So anytime I'm going anywhere, anytime I'm doing anything, it's what's in my flask.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like if I'm gonna make a stiff drink or I want to carry something classic in a flask, you're right. 114 would make a super solid choice. Again,
All about the porch founders all day long.
Yeah. Again, full body, nicely proof, great price. I think this is one of those bottles that kind of deserves to be just on everybody's shelf somewhere. At least a bottle to have and share every once in a while when you're like, cool, try something historic, try something that's been around since the 1800s. Just it's changed, maybe it's changed a little bit, but it's still the quality and the flavor is still there. And I think that it'll only continue to get better. And that brings us to Old Tub. I won't be opening this bottle, but I've got myself a cute little 375. So at some point, I'll get into the history in a little bit, but at some point, the 375s, I mean, they're still available, but these little square bottles, these little rectangular bottles are only available at the distillery. And Old Tub for a long time was a distillery only release. So it's cool seeing these bottles slowly make their way out of the distillery and into people's hands, because I think that out of everything James B. Beam Distilling, this is one of these bottles that has so much versatility that people just do not know about. And even though it's not super widely available and distributed, I think it's worth us considering and really understanding like the quality that can be produced from what we make at the James B. Beam Distilling Company. I think a lot of people see Jim Beam and they know it's our name on the door and they know that we produce a lot of it, but they don't realize that the quality that really goes into the whiskey is Jim Beam chill filtered. Yes, but that's what Old Tub is for. Old Tub is essentially unfiltered, non-chill filtered whiskey, the same identical mash bill as Jim Beam, just a little bit different, and we sell it at 100 proof. So Bottle and Bond, again, I will continue singing the praises of Bottle and Bond, but let's see. When the Bottle and Bond Act passed, so I've talked a lot about our history at James B. Beam, and I think that it's kind of important at this point to maybe just go back a little bit and talk about it for like 5 minutes. So as you know, Jacob Beam started selling his first whiskeys back in 1795, a long time ago. First generation master distiller for James B. Beam Distilling Company, not James B. Beam Distilling Company, but for Jim Beam, for the family, as a family's sake. And his first whiskey was called the Old Jake Beam Sour Mash, right? And people would essentially bring their jugs and have them filled straight from the barrels and take it home. And of course, business boomed. And I've talked about David and David M. Beam, who took the whiskey to the next level and became full-fledged distillers. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this, but just in case I didn't, they took that Old Jake Beam Sour Mash and they essentially rebranded it. And they've rebranded the distillery as the old, and it was named, instead of the DM Beam and Company Distillery, the name that everyone knew for the distillery was the Old Tub Distillery, which was essentially just a way to refer to our, spill some whiskey, to our fermentation tubs. The old tubs that were being used to ferment our distillate at that point. And the name kind of caught on, and our whiskey eventually, we ended up just changing the name of the whiskey to Old Tub Whiskey. And that was all dandy and all good. And Old Tub was one of the #1 selling bourbons in Kentucky until Prohibition. And Prohibition kind of course, threw a wrench in everything, and it threw a wrench in our distillation process as well. And that kind of hit like classic mash bill. When Jim Beam reopened the distillery in 1933, 1935, he didn't want to use the name Old Tub again. He wanted to essentially create a new era for the beans. And at the same time, the yeast strain that was being used for the classic Old Tub was lost to history. So he felt that it was disingenuous to continue calling Old Tub Old Tub. And also there was an issue that we relinquished the rights to the name during Prohibition. So because of Prohibition, we lost the rights to the name, and we lost access to that historic formula with the yeast strain. We knew what the mash bill was, but we didn't know the yeast was lost to history. So there wasn't really a way to recreate it at those times, or to really like look back and say, hey, how can we, rather than trying to recreate it, Jim Beam was smart enough to say, let's push forward, let's work on something new, something just as good. And of course, Jim Beam White and Jim Beam Black came into the world. But Old Tub, back in kind of like late 1950s and 60s, we started producing Old Tub again, just as a bottle and bond homage to all the other generations of beams that came before. And we kept it as a 4-year unfiltered bottle and bond whiskey. And it still had as I mentioned earlier, it still had very same identical mash bill that we used for Jim Beam and Jim Beam Black and everything else that well, Jim Beam and Jim Beam White, not the rye or anything else. But for a long time, it was what was going into Jim Beam Bottle and Bond, which is now discontinued. But Jim Beam Bottle and Bond wasn't unfiltered and non-chill filtered. It wasn't unfiltered. It was filtered. But now we have Old Tub in the world, and I think Old Tub, as somebody I just read the chat, you're right. I agree there. I don't think there is a better tasting whiskey at that price point that Old Tub. Old Tub is such a great value for the price. And I'm going to pour myself the very first bottle of Old Tub that I got from the distillery 5 years ago, just a little bit for fun. So go ahead and taste it, and we'll kind of chat about the flavor profile of it and what I get out of it. So from Old Tub, because of the full body flavor of the bonding process, I get so much baking spice. I get nutmeg, I get cinnamon. Again, at 4 years, it's the same age at classic Jim Beam White. So another great experiment is to pull a bottle of Jim Beam White that you might have somewhere in your back bar or somewhere on your shelves, and smell and nose it and taste it right next to Old Tub. And you'll see how much more caramel and cinnamon and kind of like herbaceousness, almost like eucalyptus mentholiness you get out of it. I think that's one of the defining characteristics for me for Old Tub. I get so much more menthol in this, but again, those are all the oils, all those beautiful flavors that are being retained due to it being an unfiltered bottle and bond whiskey. I've heard it being described as pie-like. I don't get the pie, but maybe people are sensing the baking spice, all the cinnamon that they're getting through it, and all the caramel they're getting from it. So when I tasted, it opens up in that same way. A little softer than the old Grandad. Of course, I'm thinking about all the other whiskeys that we've had. A lot softer, a lot more like delicate caramel in the flavor, but still very big, very herbaceous. And all those flavors just really open up, like very herbaceous, very peppery, but still soft and kind of delicate. Of course, you're never going to get over the bottled and bond heat, but a lot of good mid flavor palate and finish. The finish might be just a little short for a bottled and bond, but I think it, with all the other kind of like mentally eucalyptus flavors that you get in your palate, minty flavors that you get in your mouth, I think it's okay. It's not going to have that super long, big, drawn out, woody finish. But again, we're dealing with a much younger bottle and bond whiskey. We're dealing with bottle and bond whiskey, 100 proof. I think that all the flavors play really, really well together.
As we drink this sample, I wanted to invite everyone to turn on their cameras for just a second, and say thank you to Edwin. I usually do this before we get into the last one, but I've been enjoying these so much, totally forgot. That's what happens when I take a break. But yeah, hop on camera and join us for a second. We are going to launch the poll in a second as well, so make sure people are awake. But yeah, raise a glass. Thank you so much, Edwin, for coming back and joining us this evening and sharing all this amazing history with us. A new appreciation for these sub $30 bottles, you know.
Yeah.
Cheers.
You know, like in our world of drinking cast drinks and like rare releases, being able to taste through, I'm really enjoying being able to chat about historic brands and brands that we might overlook at times, including myself. But thank you for letting me on, and thank you for letting me chat about them for a good while.
Awesome. All right, everyone, raise a glass one more time for a snapshot. Cheers, everyone. Got it. Thank you.
Oh, oily roasted peanuts, rolled in spice. You're making me hungry now. I feel like I need to go out and like buy some spicy peanuts and try it out. Oh, I like this pull. Let's try it. I'm so curious what the favorite's going to be today.
So I feel like I cut you off. You were still telling us old tub stuff.
Yeah. I was really just chatting about how, you know, I guess the last point I really wanted to make is that, you know, at James Beam Distilling Company, we're always committed to quality. So even though we might be the biggest producer of American whiskey in the market, that doesn't mean, again, I know y'all know this, but I always try to repeat it. If we're not producing whiskey that you want to drink, we're not doing our job. And that's not what we want. We want you to enjoy the whiskey as much as we're enjoying making it, and as much as I personally and everybody else who works for Beam enjoys drinking it. So thanks again.
I've heard old Grandad 114 proclaimed as fantastic, which it was. But for people saying, if you want, what was it? Who's the guy on old Grandad?
Oh, Meredith Basil Hayden.
Yeah. So if you want castrate Basil Hayden for $10 less, here you go.
Yeah. I think I like hinted and alluded to that, but you said it. I didn't say it.
Get your votes in, everyone.
Now, are basil and OGD using the same yeast strain?
They're not. No. So, oh, I'm sorry. OGD and Old Granddad, and you said Old Granddad and Basil,
And
right?
basil.
No, they're not. No. So you're using the commercial yeast strain for Old Granddad and the historic yeast strain for Basil Hayden.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I was encouraging everybody, if they have a bottle of Basil Hayden around, to do a little side by side and notice the differences and also notice the similarities between the two, since they are sharing the same mash bill. That's good. I've been a huge fan of Old Top ever since I've been saving this little bottle for 5 years, and I think I'm finally going to drink it because I'm so happy that now I can actually get a bottle of Old Tub in California, and I don't have to be in Kentucky whenever I need one.
Something happened. You can get it in California now. I was in a Whole Foods of all places like 6 months ago, and they had it right there on the shelf. That's when I picked it up.
Yeah, so we started select, not I'm gonna say national distribution, but we started distribution in other states out of Kentucky or out of the distillery in right before the pandemic in 2019. Of course, pandemic shut everything down. We stopped shipping things out, and we're slowly starting to get it back out into the market now. And that's one of the reasons why we discontinued Jim Beam Bonded, because we didn't want to have two different things that were essentially the same thing. Jim Beam Bonded was always supposed to be the old tub that was available outside of the distillery, but it's almost doing a disservice to the brand itself. You know, like, we try a lot of things. This is just me again, just being fully transparent with you. We try a lot of things, and sometimes they work, and people love the Jim Beam Bonded, but also, why deny them of what it originally was supposed to be and what history says it was. So instead of so we ended up discontinuing old Jim Beam Bonded and introducing just Old Tub to everybody. But again, it's a work in progress. It's something that it's something that we need to work on as a company, to just be a little bit more clear about what we're releasing, and we're working on it, and we're trying to be more consistent about it. But again, just some fun facts for you about the brand itself.
Very cool. So people voted. Edwin, what do you think was the winner?
I'm gonna say 114 because everybody loves 114. I didn't vote for 114 because I have my favorite, but I think 114 won.
So I'm gonna guess Old Tub is your favorite, and there's a few comments on Old Tub, but you are correct. Good call. 50% voted OGD, 19% for Old Tub and Old Overholt Bottle and Bond, and then 1 or 2 votes for the other ones.
You want me to tell you what I voted for?
Yeah.
All right, I voted for Old Overholt Bottle and Bond.
Wow.
Mainly because I'm thinking about drinking it and also making cocktails with it. And like, all the old, really cool, classic, historical recipes work extremely well with Bottle and Bond.
So the old fashioned was originally a rye recipe, right?
It was originally a rye recipe, yeah. Even though it's been adapted as a bourbon, the old fashioned is kind of, it's difficult. Yes, it was originally a rye recipe, but you know, I feel like at this point it belongs in the bourbon category. But you know, cocktails like the Green Point or the Red Hook, like you'd be hard pressed to find any other like some other bourbon that was some other rye, I'm sorry, that showed the quality of all the other ingredients as well as Old Overholt Bottle and Bond. And that's just from being behind the bar. That's even before I came into the bar world. That's just like me expressing my love for it from like a very true place in my heart. It doesn't hide the flavor. It doesn't hide the character of the Amaros. When I'm thinking about lower proof like Chinaur and Red Hook, it's still like the citrus and kind of those herbaceous notes still shine through really nicely. I can go on about cocktails all day. But yeah, that's why I voted for it.
Fair enough. I'm literally Googling those two cocktails as we speak. I need more whiskey cocktails in my repertoire besides Manhattan and Old Fashioned.
You know, if y'all ever want to do a cocktail class, I'd be happy to do one with you. It'd be fun. You know, instead of doing, I mean, have you done any cocktail classes? I know it's more about tasting, but you know, something fun, something extra.
We've done a cocktail as part of the tasting, but we've never done a cocktail class, which I totally be down. I think that it's a lot more work to set it up from a virtual standpoint, but I think it's definitely doable. And if you're down, I'm down.
Cool. I'll let you know when I pull everything together, because I want to pull it all together before I tell you, hey, let's set a date and let's do it on this day.
Sounds good.
Because you know, logistics are always the hardest part.
Exactly. If there are any more questions, we'll get them on the recording. But other than that, I'm going to wrap it up and do the raffle for everyone who participates. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and quiz Edwin and ask him any questions on any Overholts or any bean products you may have. Alrighty then. Well, thank you all so very much. Do not jump off. We're going to do a quick raffle at the end. Thank you so much to Edwin for spending this evening with us and sharing all of this wonderful information. Like we said earlier, a whole new respect for this fantastic lineup, classic bourbon and rye of old. See what I did there? Good night, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, anyway. I appreciate it.